Welcome back to another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. It's the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry through interviews with some of the best in the business. On this episode, I had a conversation with Pat Fitzmaurice of FantasyPros and BettingPros. We talked about a ton of things, including how he loved the sports page growing up, playing fantasy football for the first time, his favorite types of leagues, his experiences at the Fantasy Football Expo, starting his own podcast, music, golf, the late great tags, and much more. This episode was recorded before the 2024 NFL season started, so we do bring that up a bit, just in case you were wondering. Follow Pat on Twitter at Fitz_FF. You can follow me at the Kacey Kasem and the podcast at GetReal_pod. You can find my content with Rotoballer, Optimus Fantasy, Fantasy Six Pack, and South Harmon Fantasy Football. I'm also co-hosting the Thursday afternoon show with Nate Paulvote over at Optimus Fantasy, so make sure you head over to the YouTube channel, subscribe, and get notified when we go live. And check out SundayDreamersClub.com for some awesome fantasy football inspired t-shirts and sweatshirts. This podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. And now, here's my chat with Pat Fitzmaurice on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And we will get started now. I'm so excited, as always, to bring another awesome guest onto the show. We have one of my favorites in this industry. He'll get to tell you exactly who he is. I'm not going to spoil it for you. No, I'm just kidding. It's Pat. It's Pat Fitzmaurice. Oh my gosh, I can't even say his name. I'm so excited. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on the show, Pat. Everybody, I'm sure, is very excited to get to know you. Can you just let everybody know exactly what you do in the fantasy football space?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Kacey.
For
Big
sure.
fan of you and your work, so really excited to come on and talk to you. So right now, I am sort of an editor/analyst at FantasyPros and BettingPros. We have a sister betting website too that we're trying to grow. So doing that, and mostly football. Dabble a little bit in baseball, and right now I'm actually co-hosting a weekly golf betting podcast too. So, but yeah, like 90% of it is football. And, if people want to track me on Twitter, they can find me at Fitz_FF.
Which you definitely need to do. Okay, so let's just kind of get a story about childhood and sports. What kind of relationship did you have with sports when you were growing up?
I was a junkie, pretty addicted. And, all my buddies back at the time, it's like whatever the season was, baseball in summer, football in fall, hockey in winter, pretty much anything with a ball and stick or whatever we were playing it. So, and when we weren't playing it, we were playing like sports video games or Strat-o-Matic, which is this board game where you get to manage teams. So yeah, we were pretty hooked on it. And like I was pretty early on addicted to the sports page in the newspaper. And newspapers are almost dead now, but back at the time, we in my hometown Milwaukee, there was a morning paper and an afternoon paper, and we got both at our house. And not a lot of time to read the morning paper when you're a kid going to school, but that afternoon paper, which would come at like 5:30 or whatever, I mean, I would just like plow through whatever box scores, articles, everything. And that was just like a nightly addiction for me.
So when you were playing all these sports and you were watching all these sports, is there anything that you remember from being a kid that was like one of the best sports memories or moments that you can remember, whether that be your life or, professionals?
Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to think of, there were not a ton of highlights for Milwaukee sports, like the Packers when I was a kid. Those were some pretty lean years. The Bucks had some pretty good teams. And, since we were not too far from where the Bucks played, like went to a lot of those games. They had some pretty good players back in like the early 80s when I was a kid. So, and the Brewers too. I mean, I got to see Robin Yount and Paul Molitor play in their primes. And, Yount never left the Brewers, probably my favorite athlete of all time. So getting to see him play was an absolute highlight for me.
When did fantasy football come into your life?
Yeah, that was a little later, like late in college. A friend of mine, and I'd played fantasy baseball, Kacey, for a really long time. And I always, when I'd first heard about the concept of fantasy football, I thought like well, that's stupid. Baseball has a way to account for every player, pitchers, batters, relievers, starters, whatever. You know, football, what fun is it to do just quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers when you don't get to factor in linebackers, safeties, linemen? But a friend in college talked me into doing a league. Wasn't really even a league. It was a winner take all weekly pool. We drafted teams, and the high score, I think we threw in like $5 or $10 a week, and the winner took everything every week. And I think my team kind of sucked, except then like it was the week right before Thanksgiving week. And somehow I can't remember if it was like Flipper Anderson or Stefan Page. Someone had a huge game on Monday Night Football. I don't know if it was that record-setting Flipper Anderson game. It might have been this big game that Stefan Page on the Chiefs had. And he went ballistic and won me the week. And, I think there were 10 or 12 of us. So all of a sudden I'm getting $50 just as I'm about to go home and, reconvene with old high school friends and drink a lot of beer on a Thanksgiving weekend. So, yeah, that kind of hooked me. And then the next year was like, I started a league with friends and, it spiraled from there, Casey.
The fantasy baseball aspect always like makes me perk up a little because I've played fantasy baseball. It wasn't my first go-to. Football was, but fantasy baseball is a completely different beast than fantasy football. Are you still playing you brought up baseball. Are you still playing fantasy baseball, or is that something that you haven't played in a while?
No, I still play. I have a league that has been going continuously. It's like a sort of a dynasty type league that, we've friends. One of my best friends went off to school at the University of Minnesota while I was at the University of Wisconsin. And somehow we got this league with a bunch of Minnesota people and some Wisconsin people. And this league has survived the test of time. We've had a few ownership changes, but for the most part, it's been a lot of the original crew. And yeah, we still play. And then there's also an in-house FantasyPros league that I did really poorly in this year. So I still play, but I do tend to start to lose interest a little bit around early July. When the excitement of fantasy football is starting to build. So admittedly, I kind of check out in the baseball season.
It's all right. It's all right. I couldn't do it, so more power to you. But going back to like just starting in fantasy football, and I'm sure the leagues were completely different. I mean, you already touched on that a little bit, but do you remember that first draft and how that experience was for you?
Yeah, we were drafting in my good friend's younger brother's apartment. That was, I think he had like a bedroom air conditioning unit, but we were drafting in the living room. It was probably like 98 degrees in there and hot and uncomfortable. But it was a fun draft. Nevertheless, there was a lot of beer, I think, involved. And, I drafted a team that wound up winning the championship that year. And I can't remember if I picked first or second, but Emmitt Smith was my first pick, and he wound up having a pretty good year and delivering a title to me. Or wait, actually, I take that back, Casey. I also won the second year in this league. It was Emmitt Smith in year 2. Year 1 was Barry Sanders.
Okay. Well, there
So,
you go.
yeah, we had a couple of fun running backs to watch my first couple of years in that league. So, but then, this league has continued to go on, and my winning percentage as far as taking down the championship in that league, not so good in the years that have followed those first couple of years in the early 90s.
Yeah.
It's gotten tougher as the competition has gotten a little sharper.
Yeah, that does tend to happen. I know I haven't won a championship in my home league in forever. I was winning them all at the beginning, and
Yeah.
then, you start putting out content and you kind of just you're
Everyone
helping
catches
others.
up.
You're not first.
Exactly.
So, what's your favorite type of fantasy league to be a part of, whether that's settings, scorings, or whatever?
Oh man, I mean, Dynasty is really coming on strong, but I still have to say it's probably redraft. Um, I like the leagues a little bigger sometimes. Like 12 is good, but 14 is even better. And I'm in a 16 team or two that I'm really fond of. I kind of like it when everyone's got holes in their starting lineup.
Hmm.
And, it sort of promotes the incentive to trade to try to plug those holes. So I like a nice big 12 or 14 person league with, you know, either two running backs or three wideouts, or like I've seen some, and we do this in one of the leagues I'm a commissioner of, where it's one running back, two wideouts, and then like a bunch of like three flex spots. So you can really have some flexibility in how you build your teams. But then I always prefer half point or standard to full point PPR. I'm kind of old school. I just don't like that a 0-yard catch is worth more than a 9-yard run. I'm kind of hung up on that. Now, I know people like to sort of dilute the touchdown variance with PPR because like number of receptions is a more predictable thing than touchdown scoring. And I think that's what people really like about it, that it dilutes the touchdown variance that can be so crazy week to week. I just say, like, make touchdowns worth less. There's no rule that a touchdown has to be worth 6 points. I play in some leagues where they're worth 4 points.
Yeah.
And it kind of does the same thing. So, you know, I'm still like an old schooler fighting for the standard scoring, which feels like a losing battle at this point. I'm not going to lie.
It's kind of interesting how quickly like we switched over to PPR in our home league, and then the people were like, oh, wait, he didn't go anywhere with the ball and he got a point. How did this work out? And it's like, but yeah, when I'm looking for content for like standard leagues, it's not as easy to find now as, finding PPR stuff, because that's everywhere.
Yeah, I've playfully teased my buddy Evan Silva, who I occasionally see in downtown Chicago and get together with. He started referring to it as non-PPR. And that was the first time I had ever heard it referred to as non-PPR instead of standard. And, that the non-PPR, just the term makes it sound as if like, okay, the people who aren't playing PPR are the weirdos.
Yeah.
The PPR people are the normal folks. And I'm like, I have given him grief about how he was the one who, basically put the standard people in a corner and pointed at them and mocked them. So.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I'm writing an article and it's on standard, but yeah, in parentheses, non-PPR. And I was like, okay, yep, all right, that's what we're doing now. So, okay, putting out content, how did that start? How did you decide, like, I want to start putting out fantasy football content?
Yeah. So, all right, this goes way back. I was working as like a news editor at a chain of suburban weekly newspapers in Milwaukee. And, I'd studied journalism and had kind of wanted to get into sports journalism, but like the job market was pretty tight, wound up in news. Liked it, worked with a lot of people I liked. The work wasn't terrible, a little tedious, but and then a friend who, this was in Milwaukee, and then a friend who was trying to get me to move down to Chicago happened to see an ad in the classified ads of the Chicago Tribune looking for an associate editor at Pro Football Weekly, which was kind of a they called it a magazine, but it was more like a tabloid sized newspaper covering the NFL out of a northern suburb of Chicago. And so I applied for it and I got it. And it was like really only maybe 10 to 15% fantasy football for me. We had a guy on staff who became a good friend of mine who was like sort of the fantasy guy. And we contributed and did mocks and occasionally did like some web articles. But for the most part, I was just, an editor helping with the NFL coverage. And after a couple of years, I left the company just to go and get a job that paid more. But I left on really good terms, and they asked if I wanted to freelance doing fantasy stuff and doing fantasy rankings after I'd gone. And the whole concept of fantasy rankings was sort of new to me. But yeah, I gave it a shot, and I continue to have that sort of freelancer part-time relationship with Pro Football Weekly for a long time. And, it was kind of nice. They just sort of let me be a lone wolf. And if I had any ideas for stuff I wanted to do, they basically gave me carte blanche. And it was nice until they closed their doors. And then I remember I was like on a golf weekend with some friends, and we were sitting out in this patio bar, and all of a sudden I saw like the notice that Pro Football Weekly had basically closed down. I'm like, oh, all right, I guess I'm not doing freelance for them anymore. And then Melissa Jacobs, aka the football girl, who I'd followed and enjoyed her content for a while, just put something out on Twitter like, "Oh, I'm really going to miss Pro Football Weekly, especially Pat Fitzmaurice's fantasy stuff." And I know that just kind of got the wheels turning. And after a while, a couple of weeks maybe, I reached out to Melissa and asked, like, "Hey, would you ever want fantasy content on the Football Girl site?" Like, I kind of wanted to be a lone wolf somewhere else, have a place to park my content without actually going to the trouble of doing a website myself, since I'm technologically a complete idiot. And she was game. And so we had a nice partnership for several years and got to be really good friends. And, I think the world of Melissa, but then Fantasy Pros came along and offered me a job, and I took it. My first full-time job in the fantasy industry, pretty, well past the midpoint of my professional career, I think, but better late than never.
Well, that's awesome to hear the whole story and being a part of Fantasy Pros. Like that's such a that's such a big deal. Like when I was telling one of my wife's friends about how I put out fantasy content, the first thing they were like for Fantasy Pros. So like, yeah, and he's just a casual player. So I was like, that's super dope that like you can recognize that brand. So being a part of a brand like that, like how cool was that coming on when you first started? I mean, I'm sure it's cool now, but how was it when you first started?
Yeah, really cool. So we've got like I was sort of because I'd done rankings for a long time when they first started. They always wanted to build the company more around the tools than fantasy content. Like
Mhm.
fantasy content was sort of the last component they added as far as their offerings to users. It's always about the tools, and one of the things they were sort of made their name on was their aggregate rankings. And I remember like I didn't even know they were tracking me until like after the first season they tracked people. I can't remember if it was like 2010 or something like that, where one of the editors at Pro Football Weekly called me and he was like, "Hey, you won some award for rankings." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And apparently Fantasy Pros had gotten in touch, and I wasn't even on Twitter at the time. And so they couldn't really reach out to me directly. They reached out to my editor, and I hadn't won. It was like 20 people were in the in-season rankings competition. I guess they only found 20 people who were doing in-season rankings at the time, and just kind of used their methodology to sort us out. And I remember Andy Behrens of Yahoo was actually the guy who won that first one, and I came in second to Andy, but they gave me some little, I don't know, ribbon or trophy or something like that. And they just had me in the contest all along, and eventually we're like, "Hey, would you want to use our rankings tool?" We came up with this thing that, yeah, it was much easier than basically doing it on typing it out every week and sending it to my editor. So yeah, just kind of had this long relationship with Fantasy Pros, and they have this weekly feature that we still run to this day, Featured Pros, where we ask people who are rankers for us to weigh in on just little questions, and submit an answer of like 3 to 5 sentences, just short stuff, nothing that should be taxing people's time. Or they'd always ask me to do that, so I got to know some of the people who sent those invitations, and just they had known me for a while. And it's funny, after I got hired, like some of the developers were like, "Hey, do you know," because they give like numerical codes to all the people who do rankings, like your number, whatever. And a lot of our developers thought it was cool that like I'm one of the only people left with like a single digit code as one of the originals. So I don't know. That's my geek badge of honor, I guess.
That's great though. Yeah. I mean, going to Fantasy Pros back in the day, I remember just like seeing the rankings and being a fan and getting to like do my own rankings versus and do all this other fun stuff. And yeah, it's always been such an awesome tool. And then the whole editing portion of what you do with Fantasy Pros, how do you go about that? How did that come about?
Yeah. So I guess professionally, ever since that job as a news editor at that chain of suburban papers really early in my career, it's just kind of been one editing job for me after another. Like I've always done that. I was working at the Chicago Tribune Company for a long time. So that was just kind of up my alley, working with writers and copy editing their stuff, and working with them, pitching them ideas, um, fact checking, correcting, proofreading, all that. So I fit in there, and it's been nice. I get to work with writers a little bit. I mean, now they've got me more focused on the analyst stuff at Fantasy Pro, so I don't get to do quite as much editing as I used to. But like just evaluating writers, working with new writers, I still enjoy that stuff. And like today, I was just putting together this collaborative thing that a bunch of the analysts had done, and I just kind of it's the kind of stuff I used to do a lot of like 5-10 years ago, and I kind of missed it, and it was nice to get another taste of that.
So, because I was talking to somebody about the editing process, somebody that was new to writing, and they were like, I got all this feedback and I feel bad because I'm like, you know, getting back feedback and, I thought I did a good job and all this stuff. And I kind of was like, well, yeah, but taking that feedback and acknowledging that they actually gave you the feedback and taking that and going with it, you're going to continue to improve. But what kind of advice do you have for new writers who are just starting out and are putting out their content for the first time for others to read?
Yeah, and that can be tough when you're especially like a new content creator, and I know maybe you're working with an editor who's kind of a stickler about like the rules of the road and everything, and grammar, punctuation, and there is like a maze of rules. And some people are like, whatever, if it's casual conversation, that's fine. I mean, and especially with some of the young writers now who grew up in the texting era,
Yeah.
and punctuation, capitalization optional. So I would say one thing, like if anyone wants to get a really effective manual, and I mean, this is a concise manual, that a book that can literally fit into your back pocket. It's called The Elements of Style. And this is a book on, like, it is the best instruction manual on writing that's ever been done. And you can read it in like an hour, an hour or two. But like pretty much everything is there, and there's like a glossary and everything. So if you ever come up upon a certain thing, like, oh, do I use a comma here or not? You can probably look in this back section and find it, like what page the instructions are on pretty easily. Highly recommend that to anyone who's starting out in writing, like read it and reread it. But then just like, I know you want to get your opinions. Everyone wants to get their opinions out there. Base it at least partially on numbers. Don't drown people in numbers, but use numbers rather than just going on how you feel about certain things and your, just assessment of how good someone might be. It doesn't mean anything unless you're coming out of an NFL front office, which we are not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, use numbers and work on those leads. Like, get something in that first paragraph that's going to make people want to keep reading. Your job is to like, set that hook in the fish's mouth before you start reeling them in. Make sure you hook them with that first line, that first sentence or two. Make sure, keep them interested. Don't bore people to death with the opening paragraph, and make sure they want to keep reading your article.
Yeah, I find I get a little wordy. I get a little going back to high school and trying to, type this many sentences in a paragraph, and they're like, "No, it doesn't look that well on mobile, so don't do that." Oh, okay. Yeah. You're learning. We're all learning, So, but with Fantasy Pros and putting out content, also being behind the microphone and in front of a camera, had you ever had experience doing that before? And what has that experience been like?
Only in guest appearances on podcasts. And then I guess before I started at Fantasy Pros, I'd started my own podcast, which was, I wanted it to have kind of the vibe that your pod has, Casey, where it's like kind of casual. And I guess my hook for my podcast was that I wanted it to be like maybe 70% fantasy football conversation, and then 30% like personal, something that was, I don't know, like would help people learn more about the analyst, whether talking about wherever they're from, their hometown or whatever. I mean, I remember long conversation with JJ Zacharyson about Pittsburgh and what Pittsburgh is like. And JJ had some, hilarious observations, or like talking to someone about cooking or movies or music or whatever else came up. So that was a lot of fun, but I don't know, still have a lot of ums and ahs unintentionally sometimes, trying to polish that up, always trying to get better. Still a long way to go, but I don't know, maybe there's been a little bit of improvement. Not much, but a little.
Oh, there's probably been a whole lot. I mean, and I say that about myself too, but then I go back and listen, which you should maybe do, but I don't like it. I'm
I
not a big
can't
fan of going
I
back and
can't do
listening.
it either. I can't do it either,
Okay.
Casey.
I'll
Yeah,
guest on
just
people's shows and I'm like, I'm not gonna contribute to I'm gonna listen to maybe
yeah.
your part, but I'm not gonna listen to mine.
Yeah, I go back and listen to myself and I'm like, "Oh man, why would anyone wanna listen to my stupid Midwestern twang?" And I don't know,
Whatever.
get all self-conscious.
Well, I mean, we all feel like that. So yeah, everybody out there that's just starting, if you feel like, oh man, I don't want to listen to myself, I don't think why are people yeah, we all feel like that. So how about there's an so how do you when you're putting out content and stuff, I'm sure your friends know that that's what you do. Do they come to you for fantasy football advice? Your everyday, normal, not on the internet friends?
No, but they use it and weaponize it against me in our leagues that we,
Yeah.
played together, which I'm about to find out. Like, home league season is pretty much starting this coming weekend, and so I'm gonna find out just how much people have been using my stuff, and, when I get sniped repeatedly, I will know. So I every once in a while, someone will come to me with, like, a tough lineup decision or something like that, but for the most part, it's not so much advice, but, like, they'll send me, something where, they're sitting there at the computer and all of a sudden some, like, video pops up with me playing. Like, I've been on Pro Football Reference before where all of a sudden a Fantasy Pros video pops up and starts playing, and all of a sudden, I'm looking at something on Pro Football Reference, and there I am in the corner, which is kinda weird, and, my friends occasionally have that experience too and are always eager to share that with me and, like, sending me a video on their and, just making me watch it and embarrassing me.
Well, that's what friends are for, right?
Exactly.
So when you're putting out content and everything, what is the busiest time of the year for you when you're, doing your job?
Probably right now. I think this is kind of it, where we're right on the precipice of the heart of fantasy draft season, where, like, all the home leagues are starting now, and, we have a Discord cha we have a Fantasy Pros Discord, and on my channel where people can ask me anything, I'm starting to get, like, 25, 35 questions a day, like, almost more than I can answer, and, yeah, and then just, like, once the season gets going, especially before trading deadlines hits, and before people start to fall by the wayside with losing records where they lose interest, like those first few weeks, Casey, man, I mean, the questions are just, you've got all the content obligations for your company. And on top of that, you're getting hit up with, like, dozens and dozens of Twitter and Discord questions a day. And I used to try to answer everyone, and I still try to answer as many as I can, but there's just no way to catch up with the full deluge of questions anymore. Like, some I just have to let fall by the wayside. And apologize if anyone has asked me a question and didn't get it answered. I try, but I just can't get to all of them anymore and still, keep my wife from walking out on me and my kids from, wanting to disown me. So
No, I get that. And family is so important to like your journey and just supporting you through what you're doing. And how supportive has your family been? How important have they been for you with this whole fantasy football career that you have going?
supportive. I mean, my wife, well, I made more at Fantasy Pros than I did at my last job. So that convinced my wife that it was an okay
There you
move.
go.
Because, if it was for a hit in pay, I don't know if she would have been so supportive. So I think about my buddy, the late great Mike Tagliere, and so yeah, tags passed COVID shortly before I started at Fantasy Pros. And Tags was like sort of hell bent on getting into the fantasy industry. He had a secure job that paid him a good salary, but he really wanted to be a fantasy analyst full time. Like he was just totally up for doing that. And he had a young son and an older daughter, and his wife Tabby, who has also since she became a friend of mine too. Tabby like totally encouraged him to chase his dream of doing the fantasy thing, even though it meant like giving up a secure and well-paying job. And after Tags died, and I saw Tabby at the memorial, and I was just like, hey, I don't think I ever told you this, but it was just so awesome that you let Mike chase his dream and like didn't even though it was less financially secure and everything. And she was like, "Oh, thanks. I'm sure your wife would have been the same." And I was like, "Hell no, not have done the same." And I mean, I love her to death, but like she would not have with 2 kids in the house to like give up a secure job to go and chase fantasy football without having anything like firmly in place. No, she would not have been as encouraging as Tabby was with Tags. So yeah, it was easier to make the transition and have the support of my wife when it was actually a step up for me financially, and or at least a lateral move.
Yeah.
And probably a more secure company, since I was working for Old Media, which is rapidly crumbling. So yeah, like it wasn't a hard sell, but had I tried to do it the way Tags did it, it would have been a much harder sell.
Man, I'm glad you brought him up, and I'm glad you brought them up because they had a podcast that I used to listen to when they were both giving fantasy, and it was just
Yeah.
that was one of my favorite podcasts. So
That
yeah.
was, and that was so much what they were like in person too. And I didn't get to spend as much time around both of them together as a lot of their, really close friends, not in the fantasy football industry did, but man, like they were like that in person. Like they had this cute way of arguing and this cute way of interacting. And like they were, that was a pretty special relationship.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So the community as a whole, because the fantasy football community is so awesome, I will vouch for them and say that I just enjoy this community so much. And I know that you talked about how you came into Twitter or onto Twitter a little later. You didn't have a Twitter at the time when you started doing the rankings and everything. And when you found out that there was such a huge community, like how did that affect you? Or like, did you know that there were so many people out there that were about fantasy football?
I didn't. I just got on Twitter and was like, oh wow, there are a lot of people who are into this. So I just started following people, and people followed back, and I'm like, hey, this is a really good way to promote your stuff. And I thought it was awesome, even with the old character limits. I'm thinking of that now and like, oh my God, how did anyone ever tweet anything with those old character limits? Like, even with the much bigger, doubling the size, like I still have trouble fitting stuff in. Yeah, that's it, Casey. It was just so cool. And like I just saw someone, Leo P
Oh yeah.
at the Fantasy Football Expo, who I have been following. Like he was probably one of the first 100 people I followed, and we finally like met in person at the expo after I think I joined Twitter in like 2012. Like 12 years later, like, oh dude, I mean, you were one of the first people I thought, yeah, hanging out with him, going to breakfast, like just so cool to I don't know how much I appreciated Twitter, I think, until I went to the expo and it was like Twitter coming to life. It's like, wow, like I've been following or interacting with you for so long, and it's so cool to finally put a face to the Twitter avatar, especially if you're like me and don't actually use your photo. So
Yeah. Hey everyone, Kacey Kasem here. I want to take a moment to tell you about Sunday Dreamers Club, my fantasy football inspired t-shirt store. If you're looking for unique, stylish, and comfortable apparel that showcases your love for fantasy football, look no further than SundayDreamersClub.com. Whether you're gearing up for the next big game, hosting a draft party, or just want to sport some awesome gear, Sunday Dreamers Club has got you covered. With a variety of designs and styles to choose from, there's something for every fantasy football fan out there. Your support means the world to me, and there are so many ways you can help me grow this new small business. Grab a shirt or two for yourself or as a gift for your fantasy football league mates, or you can spread the word to your friends and family. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the show. Yeah, it's really hard knowing who's who sometimes when you're out there, because you're looking at their Twitter and you're like, oh, that's not you on Twitter. So who are you? So yeah, the expo did just happen, and we were talking about that prior to the show. But like, can you explain more, like what kind of experiences you've had out there for people who haven't got the opportunity yet to get out there?
Oh, highly recommended. So I think this was my fourth year. Yeah. And it just keeps getting better and better. And it's great. I mean, it's like people with, there are people there with over 100,000 Twitter followers, and people there with like 1 or 2,000 followers, or none, or people who just like aren't content creators who go and hang out, and like there's no cliquishness or anything like that. Everyone just, like go up and talk to whoever you want to introduce yourself to. And like I've never, I don't think I've ever seen anyone like big time anyone at the Fantasy Football Expo. Like everyone is super friendly, and just it's such a cool experience. And Bob Lung has done an amazing job just like putting together all the activities. The Friday and Saturday night parties are amazing. The King's Classic drafts on Saturday, the expo itself, although I skipped out this year because we were sending our daughter to college and kind of wanted to get home and spend a couple of quality days with her before she had to leave. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a great experience, and it's cool that we had this because there was like the FS, or I shouldn't say is the FSGA, but that is a hardcore industry thing, and it costs like the price barrier is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically for if you have like a fantasy football company, or if you're like a high ranking analyst within that company. So it's not really like a true get together. This is a true get together. And I think everyone is really grateful to Bobby Long for having come up with the idea and grown it the way he has.
Yeah, he's done such a great job with it. Like, big shout out to Bob, because like where would we be without this expo? Like, I look forward to it every year. So like being able to, and I missed the Friday this year. I missed the Friday party because our flight got diverted, and I was so mad. My dad was out there having a blast, and I'm like stuck in Little Rock, just chilling at the Chili's in the airport. So
And
looks like a blast. I can't wait to next year already. So looking forward to that. But meeting people in person too. Like, I know that when I was meeting people, it was like kind of, it did feel kind of weird, because it's like I've used to interacting with these people like this, like on a camera or through Twitter. And so like I was always like, wow, you're so much taller in person than I thought you were. So did you have any kind of reactions to people where you were like, oh wow, or like kind of like nervous? Maybe not nervous to me, but you were like, it's just a little different.
yeah, the first time I went, I was only going to be able to spend like less than 24 hours in Canton because I had to get back for, weirdly enough, a fantasy draft that was being live streamed. And I had to like, I probably could have done it from Canton, but again, technologically, I'm an idiot. So I just chose to come home and have my setup. But I remember I was going to drive it because it's like a 6-hour drive from Chicago, pretty doable. But the night before, I just had so much, like, I don't know if I don't have like a lot of social anxiety, but for some reason I was feeling social anxiety before that, like meeting all these people that, I had interacted with and, never met in person before. And all of a sudden I knew I was going to meet dozens and dozens of them all at once. And I was nervous about it. And I probably got like 2 hours of sleep. I'm like, oh, this is great. I got to make a 6-hour drive on like 2 hours of sleep, but drank a lot of coffee on the drive out. And, it turned out to be just like fantastic. I'm like, God, I can't believe I was nervous about this. Everyone is so cool and welcoming. And it really is like a community and this just very open and friendly community. So yeah, I mean, considering that we're doing this around a competitive game where we're trying to cut each other's throats when we're in leagues together, and then just everyone is so nice.
Everyone is so nice. And besides the people that are there, because it's always so awesome to hang out with those people, what aspects of the expo stand out to you as like really awesome for people that haven't been?
Yeah, the parties are great. Like the Friday one, and not to rub it in, Casey, I know you wanted to be there, but like,
Was so sad.
yeah, I love the Friday one because like
Mhm.
downtown Canton is a pretty cool scene with that Centennial Plaza. It's like just this big open city block, basically surrounded by a bunch of like bars that everyone goes to as soon as the party breaks up. But
Yep.
you've got the bags tournament going on, cornhole, whatever you want to call it. You've got people just kind of walking around, and it seems like we always get, well, I shouldn't say always, because 2023, I know there was a downpour right at the end of the party that
Yeah.
got a lot of people really wet. Um, but for the most part, like the weather has been pretty cooperative. It's always like this really nice late summer night, comfortable temperatures. Everyone's walking around in shorts and t-shirts. This year, my friend Mauricio Gutierrez from Mexico, like gave a bunch, maybe gave 24 people these luchador masks.
Yep, I saw
So
those.
we did a luchador parade and walked from the main hotel, the 4 block walk down to that plaza. And I know there were some citizens of Canton who were like, "What the hell is going on?" All
What
of a
just
sudden, they're
came into
like 24 people or so walking down the street with Mexican wrestler masks. So yeah, it's just the whole thing is awesome. All the parties, the expo, the King's Classic drafts, which I know aren't open, but you can go and watch those.
Mhm.
It's fun doing those against a bunch of your colleagues in the fantasy media. So the whole thing's just great, and I always feel like I need to sleep for 3 days when I get home from it.
Amen, man. Me too, me too. And like, I'm glad you brought up like the King's Classic. I did the Queen's Classic for the second time this year, and that's always a blast too, getting to go and hang out, even though you're like so tired and so hungover from the night before. But drink your water and you're good. So, so free time is something that I like to talk about on here. People like to say they don't have free time, but when you do have free time, I'm sure there are things that you like to do. What are some of those hobbies or things that you enjoy doing when you have free time?
Like your dad, Casey, I am hopelessly addicted to golf. I've heard he is a golf fiend, and yeah, so am I. And it doesn't help that we live like right across the street from a public course.
Oh yeah.
And the weird thing is, like, I get the itch probably the worst, like right after the fantasy season when it's like February, yeah, like terrible weather, winter weather in the Chicago area. But I don't know if it's global warming or what, but like we've had some pretty golfable days in February and March. So like I'll be like looking at the temperature, 42, not that windy. Yeah, I'm gonna go out and play golf. And so yeah, I do that a lot. And then just hanging out with the wife and kids and dog. And we are lucky we're in a pretty good spot in the suburbs. We've got this giant park down the street and this little prairie wetland right across the street and this other little nature trail maybe like a half mile down the road. So my wife and I'll just go out and walk the dog for hour and a half, and you know kind of can shut off the brain for fantasy for a while. And if my wife catches me not talking, she's like, "You're thinking about fantasy football, aren't you?" She snaps me out of it.
Like a good wife, get you back into the mindset where you need to be. But yeah, walking the dog, doing all that, I enjoy being outside, doing all that, and golfing. Who is there somebody out there that if you could pick one person to golf with just to go out and have some fun, who would you pick? It doesn't have to be anybody famous, or it doesn't have to be an athlete, just whatever.
Yeah, we're actually talking about making this happen at the Fantasy Football Expo next year. My buddy Scott Pianowski from Yahoo,
Hmm.
just a guy who we're like roughly the same age, and we like chat on Twitter about golf all the time, and and a lot of other stuff too, music, football, basketball, whatever. But yeah, we talk about golf, and I think we'd be pretty good playing partners as far as like what kind of scores we shoot. I think he's probably better than I am, but like in the same general scoring range. So I know he drives to the expo from like the Detroit area. I drive from the Chicago area. I asked him at the expo this year, like, do you drive here? Do you always have your clubs in the trunk? He's like, yeah, they never leave my trunk. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty much the same. So maybe next year, Friday of expo weekend, there's always a little bit of downtime during the day on Friday before the party. Like maybe we could sneak in
Ooh.
at least 9 holes and finally get to play together.
Yeah, that'd be really rad. And I know there's plenty of people out there that love to play golf, and I'm not one of them, wah wah. But like you said, my dad loves it, so he'd probably be like trying to hit you guys up to play golf. So you brought up your family, you brought up having kids. Are they into fantasy football as well?
Yes, my son is hopelessly addicted. My daughter, not so much. Like she played lacrosse, but as far as football, she just I've never been able to kindle any interest there. That fire just never sparked, Casey. But my son plays in at least 2 leagues. He plays in a 24-person league in his with his high school buddies. So yeah, like they are very much into it, and we'll just be sitting there out of the blue, and he'll be like, why do you like Brian Robinson Jr. so much? Like just like this accusatory, and I kind of have to explain the whole thing to him, and I'll give him the whole explanation. I'll be like, makes this face like not sold. Okay. All right, kid. Yeah, he's got his own ideas about stuff too, but yeah, it's fun. Like I've raised him as a Green Bay Packers and Wisconsin Badgers fan. I guess I've either failed or succeeded, or depending on how well those teams are doing, maybe it's a failure. But yeah, I've basically gotten him to cheer for the same teams I cheer for, which feels like a win as a dad.
Right.
But yeah, it's not the worst thing having a kid who's as much of a sports nut as you were as a kid.
Oh, that's awesome. I love to hear it. Yeah. And my dad would say the same thing about me being a Cowboys fan. I grew up this way, and that's the only way he'd have it. So, yeah, definitely. And players nowadays, do you have any players, not for fantasy purposes, but just in general, that are playing now that you find to be some of your favorites?
Yeah. Man, I'm definitely getting really fond of Jordan Love. Just seems like a cool dude, and especially since I hated the pick when the Packers chose him, and he just was really cool about biding his time behind Aaron Rodgers and just like kind of staying humble. And now he's taken the torch, and it was great to see him do so well. But he just seems like he's a cool dude on top of being pretty damn good at football. Like he's really likable and just humble and modest. And it seems like his teammates sort of respond to that low key leadership. So I dig him a lot. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I don't know. I cheer for all these guys. I like a lot of different personalities. I've always been a big fan of DJ Moore, and even though he's playing for the rival Chicago Bears now, seeing him on Hard Knocks and his personality, like, yeah, he's really cool. I'm becoming very fond of the Caleb Romo Dunze hookup. Fun to see those guys, like two highly drafted rookies, and like Hard Knocks has given us this glimpse of those guys, like, bonding, and you can tell that they're developing a friendship and like also developing chemistry on the field and like talking about, trying to figure it all out together, which is pretty cool. I like seeing that. And just, any of those stories, I wish I could think of like more examples, but I don't know, when you just like, you're working with Good Morning Football on in the background, and just like reading so much in the NFL, it's like you see all these cool stories about people. Like I was just reading something about Zamir White, and how like his life away from football and training, the one thing that he is just crazy into is horses. Like he's got a bunch of horses and is super into that. And I'm like, I had no idea about that, but it was pretty interesting to read that. And like, he's kind of this proud country boy.
Yeah.
And, just talked about that, like how he is country through and through. And I thought that was pretty cool.
I didn't know that about him. See, I'm learning something new, and thank you so much for telling me that. I'm gonna have to go research his horse love, because we'll do that after the show. So you brought up music earlier that you talked to Scott Pianowski about all kinds of stuff, and music was one of those things. Do you have a favorite band or musician?
Oh man, I'm pretty stuck in the 80s and 90s, Casey. Although like also tons of classic rock like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones or whatever. And maybe not the best band, but like one of my favorites are the Replacements.
Okay, yeah.
Old 80s band from Minneapolis that never quite made it big enough because they like to drink a lot and cause trouble, but had some pretty awesome tunes and albums. So they're a favorite for sure. But yeah, I'm trying to I occasionally dabble in slightly more modern stuff, but I'm very much stuck in the music I was listening to when I was a kid and high schooler and college student, and that'll probably never change.
As it should. It should never change. It should just stay because I'm stuck I'm like over here listening to Blink-182 constantly, and that's just
Yes.
I'm stuck. So do you get to go and listen to live music, or do you enjoy doing that? Or is that something that you haven't gotten to do in a while?
Yeah, no, I like to. And as a matter of fact, in a couple days, I will be going up to Milwaukee with a friend to see the Smashing Pumpkins and Green Day.
Yes. And
So,
Rancid, right? Rancid's on it too, right?
yeah, and Rancid,
That's
yes.
my favorite band. So
I didn't.
anyway.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I didn't even know they were on the bill until I saw that they were with Smashing Pumpkins and Green Day in
Yeah.
Minneapolis last weekend. So, yeah, I'm pretty fired up about that. I mean, I've seen Smashing Pumpkins a few times, but I've never seen Green Day, never seen Rancid. Looking forward to it. Should be nice outdoor show on a warm summer night in I forget what they're calling it now, the former Miller Park where the Brewers play. But it should be a really cool setting. I'm pumped up about it. I like
Yeah.
seeing live music. Don't get to see as much of it as I used to,
Right.
but always enjoy checking out a good show.
Yeah. Okay, that reminds me, I gotta buy tickets to that show here because September 11th. That's what date they're here. I gotta still buy tickets. There's
Yes.
plenty available. I'm gonna get one, but I'm looking forward to that, and I'm jealous of you getting to go and and see them. So have fun at that show,
Thank you.
definitely. And
Thank you.
Smashing Pumpkins. Okay, yeah, man, that brings me back too because high school listening to that Smashing Pumpkins. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's gonna be
that's
fun.
right. Yeah, that was in the mid 90s. I definitely wore out like Dookie and Siamese Dream. So
Yeah.
it's gonna be fun seeing those bands together.
Yeah. I was supposed to see Green Day with Fall Out Boy, I think, and we ended up having to leave the show early, and I didn't get to see Green Day, so here's
Oh,
hoping we're gonna get to do it this year. We're gonna get to do
yeah.
it. So, okay, kinda going back just before we, like, really wrap up, I wanna touch on a few things that have to do with putting out content for new people that are just trying to get into the space and don't know where to get started. If somebody's wanting to, like, either podcast or start writing or whatever, what kind of advice do you have for new people that are just starting?
I think versatility really helps. It's probably not just enough to consider yourself a writer or a talker just exclusively. It helps to be able to do both, to do a podcast, to be able to write good articles, and to like be able to produce the articles and just be able to do graphic stuff. Like the more ways that you can help a content company
Mhm.
um, put stuff out, the better. Not just front end, but also back end. So like acquiring new skills might be part of it. And like I'm kind of lucky that I've never had to produce my own podcast. Even when I was doing my own, I hooked up with this guy who's been a great friend, Colm Kelly, who's based in
Oh, yeah.
Ireland,
Mhm.
actually. And Colm is great. I love Colm. He's become an awesome friend for life. And but like I didn't have that wherewithal, and it would have been much easier if I had been able to produce my own podcast. Luckily, he was there. But yeah, the more skills you can acquire, the better. And then I don't want to go too big on network, but it does help to like sort of put yourself out there on Twitter and get to know people. And you know, and we've been talking about it, Casey, but it's really an open and inviting community. And
Mhm.
if you put yourself out there in a non-abrasive way, you will make friends in the space. And it's always good to have friends and allies.
100%. Yeah. Everybody's been so helpful. And like when I first started, I reached out to people and just kind of picked their brains and found a few people that I had been following for a while who kind of helped me out and told me like, try this program, do this, see if that works. So yeah, it is important to try to time network. Yeah. Reach out to people and everything. And I know that when I first started too, I was concerned, like, how do I reach out to these people, or am I going to bother them or whatever? But what kind of ways can people feel more comfortable reaching out for advice or help?
Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of it. Twitter is always a great way, and you can ask people, like if they tweet something and just like reply to them, and if you have a question for them about like being a content creator or whatever,
Mhm.
9 times out of 10 at least, they will be happy to give you some sort of response. Sometimes they might say, hey, like they might follow you and say, hey, I just followed you, shoot me a DM and we can talk more about it offline, privately, where not everyone can see the conversation.
Mhm.
um but generally people are willing to help, and I know sometimes people maybe ask a question that I just like can't answer, where I don't want to be like a poser and just make up some BS answer when I don't have and I'll just tell them like, I don't really have any experience with that. Sorry, you might have to ask someone else. But like, um, that's about as unhelpful as people will get for the most
Right.
part, where they just say like, sorry, I don't have any experience in that particular thing you're asking me about, but, and then sometimes they might even suggest someone who does.
Yeah, that's always nice when they suggest someone who does, and then you kinda
Yeah.
have that, like, I'll introduce you to them, or here you go,
Yeah.
like, and that way you kinda yeah.
And
So
people are, yeah, generally pretty happy to make introductions.
yeah. Yeah, I've noticed that on this show that most people that come on are like, if you need any advice on, like, how to do something, I can give you a little bit, what I have to offer. So, yeah, this community
Sure.
has been so helpful, and I wouldn't be where I am, and I know you wouldn't be where you are either if it weren't for other people in this community just having our backs. So,
Amen.
always gotta always gotta give plugs to the people that help, I appreciate that so much.
Definitely.
I also appreciate you so much. Like, I've been following you for a long time. Like, when I first started playing fantasy football, you were one of the go-to people. Like, that's just how it is, and people were like, "Oh, that just means I've been around for a long time." Nah, man, I really appreciate you consistently putting out great content. So, and being such a nice guy too. Like, that's like
Oh,
the cherry on top. So,
thanks, Casey. Really, kind of you to say, and like you have for quite a while now, like been one of the people who like everyone in the space just loves. Like everyone thinks the world of you, and your person, like you are just this very engaging and open personality, and it's just really great to get to know you better with this conversation. And yeah, I've never heard say anything but great things about you and your work, and I appreciate you.
oh, thank you. You're talking to the wrong people though. There's people out there that don't like
I haven't met him yet.
yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't met him yet.
Yeah, just stay clear of them. You're good. Just stick around the people you're sticking around. Oh, Pat, it's been so awesome having you on the show. But before we go, I do want you to go ahead and plug your stuff one more time. Let everybody know again where they can follow you because they definitely need to be if they're not already. So you can go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. Yeah, so go out and get yourself a Fantasy Pros premium membership so you can sync all your freaking leagues
Yeah.
through our service, and let us like we have this army of awesome developers who create all these great tools to make managing a fantasy team pretty easy. Well, not easy. You still have to make the decisions yourself, but will lay out all the information for you for each of your team, waivers, trade suggestions, everything. And like you can literally sync all your leagues from a bunch of different platforms in like less than 30 seconds or whatever. And we also, I know we're on the cusp of like the biggest fantasy football draft weekend of the year.
Okay, note here. I was a little slow to get this one out. I'm very sorry, but you should still go check out Fantasy Pros.
Get those reps in. Like check out the Fantasy Pros mock draft simulator, which you can pretty much customize to fit your exact league settings. And if you have a premium membership with us, you can even like use our intel to like, you can design like some of your opposing drafters to draft the way people in your league draft, which is kind of fun. So all those goodies, like our developers are trying to please you, and they are the true stars of Fantasy Pros. Let them work for you. And people can find me at Fitz_FF on Twitter. And be sure to check out the Fantasy Pros football podcast, the Fantasy Pros Dynasty podcast. And if you're a degenerate golf bettor, we've got 1 or 2 more episodes coming up of the BettingPros PGA podcast.
Excellent. Everybody, please go check everything out that he just said, because important. And drafts are here. We're so excited. So great time of the year. And everybody, I really do appreciate you listening to this podcast. Like, seriously. All right. Well, make sure you come back next week for another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And also remember to stay rad.
Get real. Time to get real, everybody.